Welcome back to another night of spine-chilling encounters. Tonight, we're venturing into the vast, desolate expanses of America's deserts, where the darkness holds secrets that defy explanation. These aren't just stories about strange lights in the sky. These are terrifying accounts of close encounters that left witnesses forever changed. From the Mojave's endless dunes to Arizona's remote highways, we'll explore 5 bone-chilling tales of alien abductions, UFO sightings, and otherworldly encounters that occurred in places where help is hundreds of miles away. So dim the lights, get comfortable, and prepare yourself for stories that will make you question what lurks beyond our world. But first, let me tell you about Sarah's encounter with beings that emerged from a craft hovering silently above the Nevada desert, their eyes reflecting an intelligence that was definitely not human. Marcus Chen had driven through the Mojave Desert countless times during his years as a long-haul trucker, but nothing had prepared him for what he would encounter on that moonless October night in 2019. The familiar stretch of Highway 127 between Baker and Death Valley had always been his favorite route, peaceful, predictable, and beautifully desolate under the star-filled sky. It was just past midnight when Marcus first noticed something unusual in his rearview mirror. A soft, pulsing light appeared on the horizon behind him, too bright to be another vehicle's headlights, and moving in a way that defied explanation. The light seemed to dance across the desert floor, weaving between the scattered Joshua trees like it was following some invisible path. Marcus pulled over at the next rest stop, a small dirt clearing beside the highway, marked only by a weathered picnic table and a broken trash can. He stepped out of his cab, the desert air hitting his face with its familiar dry warmth. The silence was absolute. No wind, no insects, just the gentle ticking of his cooling engine. That's when he saw them clearly for the first time. 3 distinct lights hung in the air about a mile away, each one roughly the size of a basketball from his perspective. They moved in perfect synchronization, rising and falling in slow, hypnotic patterns. The lights weren't harsh like spotlights or soft like lanterns. They had an otherworldly quality that seemed to pulse with their own internal energy, casting an eerie blue-white glow across the desert landscape. Marcus reached for his phone to record what he was seeing, but the device was completely dead despite showing a full charge just minutes earlier. His CB radio crackled with static, and even his truck's electrical system began behaving strangely. The dashboard lights flickering in rhythm with the mysterious objects in the sky. As he watched, mesmerized, the 3 lights began to move closer. They maintained their triangular formation, but now Marcus could see details that made his blood run cold. The lights weren't coming from any conventional aircraft. There were no wings, no rotors, no visible means of propulsion. They simply glided through the air with an impossible smoothness. Defying every law of physics, his breath started forming small clouds in the suddenly frigid air, and frost began accumulating on his truck's windshield, despite the desert's typical warmth. The lights were now close enough that he could make out their true nature. They weren't separate objects at all, but 3 points of illumination on a single, massive triangular craft. The craft was enormous, easily the size of a football field, yet it moved with absolute silence. Its surface appeared to be a dark, matte material that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Only the 3 corner lights and a series of smaller pulsing dots along its edges made it visible against the star-filled sky. Marcus felt a deep, primal fear settle in his stomach as the craft continued its approach. When the object was directly overhead, roughly 200 feet above him, it stopped completely. Marcus found himself bathed in a cone of pale blue light that seemed to emanate from the craft's center. The light felt warm against his skin, but there was something deeply unsettling about it, as if it was somehow scanning him, reading him, learning everything about who he was. In that moment of illumination, Marcus experienced something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He could hear voices, not through his ears, but directly inside his mind. They spoke in a language he didn't recognize, yet somehow he understood their meaning. They were discussing him, analyzing him, debating something about his suitability for an unknown purpose. The mental voices grew more intense, accompanied by images that flashed through his consciousness like a sludshot from hell. He saw vast underground facilities carved into desert rock, filled with beings that were definitely not human. Their elongated limbs and oversized heads moved with an alien grace as they tended to rows of what appeared to be human subjects, suspended in transparent cylinders filled with glowing fluid. Marcus tried to run, but his legs wouldn't respond to his commands. The blue light seemed to have paralyzed him completely, leaving him standing helplessly beside his truck while the alien craft hovered overhead. He could only watch in terror as a section of the craft's underside began to iris open like a mechanical eye, revealing a circular opening that pulsed with the same eerie blue radiance. From within that opening, something began to descend. At first, it looked like a tendril of light, but as it grew closer, Marcus realized it was some kind of translucent tube or beam. The end of it widened as it approached him, and he could see movement within its luminous walls, shapes that looked disturbingly organic, as if the light itself was alive. Just as the beam was about to reach him, Marcus heard the distant rumble of an approaching vehicle. The sound seemed to break whatever hold the aliens had on him, and suddenly he could move again. He dove behind his truck, just as a pair of headlights appeared on the horizon, growing rapidly larger as another long-haul trucker approached on the highway. The moment the other truck came into view, the alien craft's lights dimmed dramatically. The descending beam retracted with lightning speed, and the circular opening sealed itself shut. Within seconds, the massive triangular object began rising rapidly into the night sky, its three-corner lights growing smaller and smaller until they disappeared completely among the stars. The other trucker, a veteran driver named Bill Rodriguez, pulled over when he saw Muckas standing in the rest area looking shaken and disoriented. Bill later told investigators that Muckas appeared to be in a state of shock, repeatedly mumbling about lights in the sky and voices in his head. What disturbed Bill most was the condition of Muckas's truck. Every piece of electronic equipment had been completely fried, as if hit by a massive electromagnetic pulse. Muckas spent the next 3 hours waiting for a tow truck, while Bill stayed with him, neither man speaking much about what might have happened. It wasn't until days later, when Muckas finally worked up the courage to file a report with the National UFO Reporting Center, that he learned he wasn't alone. 7 other witnesses had called in sutungs of unusual lights in the Mojave Desert that same night, all describing similar triangular formations and electromagnetic interference. But Marcus's encounter had lasting effects that went far beyond a damaged truck and a frightening story. In the weeks that followed, he began experiencing vivid nightmares filled with the same images he'd seen during his mental contact with the beings. He would wake up screaming about underground laboratories and human subjects floating in glowing tanks. Sleep became his enemy, and the desert highways he'd once loved now filled him with an overwhelming sense of dread. Most disturbing of all were the physical changes Marcus began to notice. A small, perfectly circular mark appeared on his forearm, a mark that hadn't been there before his encounter. The mark was slightly raised and had an unusual metallic sheen that seemed to shift colors depending on the light. When he showed it to doctors, they were baffled by its composition and couldn't explain how it had formed. The mark would occasionally grow warm, always at exactly 3:17 a.m., waking Marcus from whatever restless sleep he'd managed to find. During these episodes, he would feel an inexplicable urge to return to that same rest stop in the Mojave, as if something was calling him back to finish what had been started on that terrifying night. Muckas never returned to long-haul trucking. The open roads that had once represented freedom and adventure now felt like hunting grounds where unseen predators waited in the darkness above. He took a job at a local warehouse, working day shifts and avoiding travel whenever possible. But late at night, when the mark on his arm began to burn and the alien voices whispered in his dreams, Muckas couldn't shake the feeling that his encounter in the Mojave Desert was far from over. But sometimes the desert reveals secrets that challenge everything we think we know about our place in the universe. Our next story takes us deeper into the unknown. Our second tale takes us to the otherworldly landscape of Joshua Tree National Park in California, where the twisted arms of ancient trees reach toward star-filled skies like desperate prayers. It was October 2019 when marine biologist Dr. Sarah Chen decided to escape the suffocating confines of her Lowe's Angels Laboratory for a solo camping trip among these alien-looking sentinels of the Mojave Desert. Sarah had always found solace in the desert's harsh beauty, but she'd chosen this particular weekend for its promise of optimal stargazing conditions. The new moon meant complete darkness, and the weather forecast promised crystal clear skies. She'd packed her high-powered telescope, camping gear, and enough supplies for 3 days of solitude among the Joshua trees. The first day passed without incident. Sarah set up her campsite near a cluster of particularly massive Joshua trees, their gnarled branches creating an almost protective circle around her tent. As darkness fell, she positioned her telescope and began her observations, documenting celestial phenomena with the methodical precision that had made her reputation in marine biology. It was around midnight when she first noticed the unusual silence. The desert, typically alive with the subtle sounds of nocturnal creatures, had fallen completely quiet. Even the constant whisper of wind through the Joshua tree branches had ceased. Sarah lowered her eye from the telescope eyepiece, suddenly aware that something fundamental had changed in the environment around her. The temperature had dropped significantly, her breath now visible in small puffs, despite the relatively mild October weather. More disturbing was the quality of the silence itself. It wasn't simply the absence of sound, but rather a heavy, oppressive quiet that seemed to press against her eardrums like water pressure at depth. That's when she saw the light. At first, Sarah assumed it was an aircraft, perhaps a military jet from one of the nearby bases. But as she watched, the light began to move in ways that defied conventional physics. It descended vertically without any visible means of propulsion, then stopped abruptly about 50 feet above the desert floor, hovering with perfect stability. The light was unlike anything in Sarah's experience. It wasn't the harsh white of searchlights or the warm yellow of conventional aircraft lighting. Instead, it pulsed with an ethereal blue-green luminescence that seemed to shift and flow like bioluminescent plankton in disturbed water. As a marine biologist, Sarah was intimately familiar with natural bioluminescence, but this was something entirely different. Her scientific training kicked in, and Sarah reached for her camera, determined to document whatever phenomenon she was witnessing. But as she raised the device, the light suddenly expanded, growing from a point source to a massive disc-shaped object that blocked out a significant portion of the star field above. The craft, for lack of a better term, was enormous. Sarah estimated its diameter at roughly 200 feet, its surface appearing to be composed of some kind of metallic material that reflected the starlight in strange, shifting patterns. Most unsettling were the complete absence of any visible seams, joints, or mechanical features. The object appeared to be constructed from a single piece of seamless material, as Sarah watched in fascination and growing fear. Smaller lights began to appear around the perimeter of the craft. These moved independently, detaching from the main vessel and beginning to descend toward the desert floor. 3 of them approached her campsite, moving with deliberate purpose through the Joshua trees. Sarah's scientific curiosity warred with her survival instincts. Part of her wanted to document this unprecedented encounter, while another part screamed at her to run. The decision was made for her when she found herself unable to move. Not paralyzed in the traditional sense, but rather held in place by some invisible force that seemed to emanate from the approaching lights. The smaller craft, each about the size of a compact car, settled silently among the Joshua trees. Up close, Sarah could see that they shared the same seamless construction as the larger vessel. But more disturbing was what emerged from them. The beings that stepped out duffed easy description, their forms seeming to shift and blur at the edges of her vision. They were tall, perhaps 7 feet in height, with elongated limbs that moved with an unsettling fluidity. Their skin, if it could be called that, appeared to be a translucent gray that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Most disturbing were their eyes, large and completely black, like pools of infinite depth that seemed to draw in Sarah's consciousness. Communication, when it came, wasn't through spoken words, but rather through direct mental contact. Sarah found thoughts that weren't her own flowing through her mind, concepts and ideas that her human brain struggled to process. They spoke of observation, of study, of the need to understand the biological diversity of her planet. What followed was a period of time that Sarah would later struggle to reconstruct. She remembered being led, though she couldn't recall walking, to one of the smaller craft. The interior was a seamless continuation of the exterior, with no visible controls or instruments, just smooth surfaces that pulsed with that same ethereal light. The beings conducted what could only be described as examinations, though their methods were unlike anything in terrestrial medicine. They seemed more interested in her consciousness than her physical form, probing her memories and knowledge with a gentle but insistent mental touch. Sarah found herself sharing her understanding of marine ecosystems, her research into deep-sea bioluminescence, her theories about life in extreme environments. Time seemed to flow differently during the encounter. What felt like hours of interaction might have been minutes, or perhaps the reverse. Sarah's perception of causality became fluid, with events seeming to occur simultaneously rather than in sequence. She witnessed impossible vistas, landscapes that couldn't exist on Earth, oceans filled with creatures that defied biological classification. The beings showed her images of other worlds, other forms of life that had evolved in environments radically different from Earth. Desert worlds where crystalline entities drew sustenance from solar radiation. Ocean planets where vast intelligences moved through liquid methane seas, gas giants where consciousness existed as electromagnetic patterns in the upper atmosphere. But perhaps most disturbing was their revelation about Earth itself. Through their mental communication, Sarah understood that they had been observing human civilization for centuries, studying the rapid changes occurring in the planet's ecosystems. They expressed something that might have been concern about the accelerating rate of species extinction, the acidification of the oceans, the disruption of climate patterns. The encounter reached its climax when the beings attempted to share their perspective on time itself. Sarah's consciousness was somehow expanded, allowing her to perceive the desert not as a static landscape, but as a dynamic system changing across geological timescales. She watched the Joshua trees grow and die across centuries, saw the rise and fall of indigenous civilizations, witnessed the arrival of European settlers, and the subsequent transformation of the ecosystem. The vision was overwhelming, too vast for her human mind to fully comprehend. Sarah felt her consciousness beginning to fragment under the weight of such expanded awareness. Perhaps sensing her distress, the beings gently withdraw their mental contact, allowing her perception to contract back to its normal human parameters. The return to her campsite was as mysterious as her departure. Sarah found herself standing beside her telescope, the stars wheeling overhead in their familiar patterns. The silence had lifted, replaced by the normal sounds of desert nightlife. Her camera lay beside her, its memory card containing only the photos she'd taken before the encounter. But physical evidence of the experience remained. Sarah's watch, which had been working perfectly, now ran exactly 17 minutes slow. More disturbing, she discovered a small mark on her forearm, a perfect triangle of 3 tiny puncture wounds that formed a pattern unlike anything she'd seen in her biological research. The psychological aftermath was perhaps more significant than any physical evidence. Sarah found herself changed by the encounter, her perspective on life and consciousness fundamentally altered. Her research took on new dimensions as she began to explore the possibility of non-terrestrial intelligence, publishing papers that raised eyebrows among her academic colleagues. She returned to Joshua Tree National Park several times over the following months, hoping to repeat the encounter or find additional evidence. But the desert kept its secrets, offering only the eternal dance of stars above the twisted arms of ancient trees. Sarah's experience remained a singular event, a window into possibilities that challenged everything she thought she knew about life in the universe. The Joshua Tree abduction, as Sarah privately called it, became a defining moment in her life. Whether the encounter was real or some kind of elaborate hallucination brought on by the desert's isolation, its impact was undeniable. It opened her mind to possibilities beyond the narrow focus of terrestrial biology, launching her on a journey of discovery that would reshape her understanding of consciousness, intelligence, and humanity's place in the cosmic order. But the desert holds deeper mysteries than abandoned military experiments. Sometimes the encounters are far more intimate and terrifying. Dr. Sarah Chun had spent 3 years studying the nocturnal wildlife patterns of the Sonoran Desert, but nothing in her research had prepared her for what she would encounter on that October night in 2019. Armed with her thermal imaging equipment and years of field experience, she thought she understood every sound, every shadow, every movement that belonged in this harsh landscape. The research station sat 40 miles southeast of Phoenix, a modest collection of trailers and equipment surrounded by endless stretches of saguaro cacti and creosote bush. Sarah had chosen this remote location specifically for its isolation from human activity, allowing her to document the true behavior of desert predators without interference. She had no idea that she herself was about to become the subject of observation. It was 11:47 p.m. when Sarah first noticed the anomaly on her thermal sensors. She was monitoring a section of desert where she'd been tracking a family of kit foxes, the small creatures showing as bright orange shapes on her screen as they hunted for insects and small rodents. But suddenly, a massive heat signature appeared at the edge of her monitoring range, far larger than any known desert animal. The signature was roughly circular, approximately 30 feet in diameter, and it radiated heat in a pattern unlike anything in her extensive database. Desert animals showed predictable thermal patterns, hot cores with cooler extremities, but this object displayed uniform heat distribution with strange pulsing variations that seemed almost rhythmic, like a heartbeat. Sarah adjusted her equipment, thinking it might be a malfunction. She'd invested thousands in these sensors, and they'd never given her false readings before. But as she fine-tuned the calibration, the signature remained, and more disturbing still, it appeared to be moving in her direction at a steady pace of roughly 15 miles per hour. Through her night vision scope, Sarah scanned the desert in the direction of the thermal anomaly. The landscape appeared normal. Nothing but the familiar silhouettes of cacti and the occasional movement of small nocturnal creatures. But her thermal equipment continued to track the approaching heat source, now less than 2 miles from her position. She grabbed her radio to contact the main research facility, but found only static. This wasn't unusual in the desert, where radio communications could be spotty, but the timing felt ominous. Sarah had been working alone for weeks without incident, but now, with something unexplained approaching her location, the isolation felt suddenly threatening. The thermal signature stopped approximately half a mile from her station. On her screen, Sarah watched as the large circular heat source remained stationary for nearly 20 minutes. During this time, smaller signatures appeared to detach from the main object, moving in coordinated patterns that suggested intelligence rather than random animal behavior. These smaller signatures, each about the size of a human, began to spread out in what appeared to be a systematic search pattern. Sarah counted 7 distinct heat sources, all moving with purpose through the desert terrain. They seemed to be conducting some kind of survey, pausing at specific locations, spending several minutes at each spot before moving to the next predetermined position. Sarah's scientific training warred with her growing fear. Part of her was fascinated by this unprecedented data, but her survival instincts screamed that she was witnessing something that defied all natural explanation. She began recording everything, her hands shaking as she operated the equipment that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. At 12:20 a.m., one of the smaller heat signatures began moving directly toward her research station. Sarah watched its approach on her thermal display, her mouth dry with terror, as she realized that whatever was out there knew exactly where she was. The signature moved with unwavering purpose, navigating the desert terrain as if it possessed perfect knowledge of her location. Sarah turned off all her lights and crouched behind her equipment trailer, trying to make herself as small and invisible as possible. Through her night vision scope, she finally saw them. 3 figures moved across the desert with an unsettling gliding motion, their forms humanoid but wrong in ways that made her brain struggle to process what she was seeing. They were tall, perhaps 7 feet in height, with elongated limbs that seemed to bend at impossible angles. Their heads were disproportionately large, and even through the green haze of night vision, Sarah could see that their skin had a reflective quality that seemed to absorb and redirect light in unnatural ways. The beings moved without sound across terrain that should have crunched under any normal footstep. They carried devices that emitted soft, pulsing lights, and as they worked, Sarah realized they were taking samples. Soil, plant matter, even insects that they somehow captured with movements too quick for her eyes to follow. One of the creatures approached within 50 feet of her hiding spot. Sarah held her breath, pressing herself against the cold metal of her trailer as the being stopped and appeared to scan the area. Its head turned in her direction, and for a terrifying moment, she was certain it had detected her presence. The creature's eyes, visible even through her night vision equipment, were large and dark, reflecting light like polished obsidian. When it looked toward her hiding place, Sarah felt a pressure in her mind, as if something was trying to push past her thoughts and examine her memories. The sensation was invasive and deeply wrong, like having someone rifle through her most private thoughts. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the creature turned away and rejoined its companions. Sarah watched through her scope as the 3 beings continued their systematic collection of samples, working with an efficiency that spoke of long practice and specific objectives. At one 12:15 a.m., the beings began to withdraw. Sarah tracked their movement back toward the main heat signature, which had remained stationary throughout their ground operation. As the smaller signatures merged with the larger one, Sarah witnessed something that challenged everything she thought she knew about physics and reality. The massive heat signature began to rise. Through her thermal imaging, Sarah watched as the 30-foot circular object lifted vertically from the desert floor, gaining altitude with impossible smoothness. There was no sound of engines, no visible means of propulsion, just a steady ascent that defied gravity itself. As the object reached an altitude of approximately 500 feet, it began to emit a low-frequency hum that Sarah felt more than heard. The sound seemed to resonate through her bones, making her teeth ache and causing her equipment to malfunction. Her thermal sensors flickered and died, leaving her with only her night vision scope to track the object's departure. The craft, for Sarah now had no doubt that's what it was, accelerated with sudden, impossible speed. One moment it hung motionless in the desert sky. The next, it was a distant point of light, disappearing toward the western horizon. The acceleration was so rapid that Sarah's mind struggled to accept what she had witnessed. In the aftermath, Sarah sat in the darkness of the desert, her scientific worldview fundamentally shattered. She had documented everything, but she knew that her thermal recordings would be dismissed as equipment malfunction. Her testimony as the delusions of an isolated researcher suffering from desert hallucinations. When she finally worked up the courage to examine the area where the beings had been working, Sarah found the evidence of their presence. The soil had been disturbed in precise circular patterns, and several plants showed signs of having samples removed with surgical precision. Most disturbing of all, she found footprints in the sand, impressions that were clearly humanoid, but wrong in their proportions and depth. Dr. Sarah Chun never published her findings from that night. She completed her research project and returned to academic life, but she never again worked alone in remote locations. The desert had shown her that humanity was not alone, and that knowledge was a burden she would carry in silence for the rest of her career. But sometimes, late at night in her university office, Sarah would pull up the thermal recordings from that October evening, studying the data that proved she hadn't imagined any of it. The truth was out there in the Sonoran desert, continuing its mysterious work under the cover of darkness, far from the eyes of a world not yet ready to accept what lurked beyond the stars. But our next story takes us even deeper into the unknown, where a family camping trip becomes a nightmare of missing time and unexplained phenomena. Dr. Alina Vasquez had spent 3 years at the Atacama Large Millimeter Array, scanning the cosmos for signs of extraterrestrial intelligence. The Chilean desert stretched endlessly around the observatory, a landscape so barren it resembled Mars itself. But on the night of March 15th, the universe decided to look back. Alana adjusted the massive radio telescope's orientation, her fingers dancing across the control panel with practiced precision. The ALMA facility hummed with quiet efficiency, its 66 antennas working in perfect synchronization to peer into the deepest reaches of space. At 2:30 in the morning, she was alone, except for the security guard making his rounds. The first anomaly appeared as a faint blip on her monitoring screen. A signal unlike anything in their database, pulsing with mathematical precision from a point roughly 12 light-years away. Alana's heart raced as she cross-referenced the coordinates with known stellar objects. Nothing should exist at that location. She initiated a full spectrum analysis, her hands trembling slightly as she worked. The signal strengthened, revealing complex patterns that seemed almost intentional, like a message encoded in electromagnetic radiation. Alina had dreamed of this moment her entire career, but now that it was happening, terror crept up her spine. The observatory's lights flickered suddenly, casting dancing shadows across the control room. Alina glanced up from her screens, noting the strange amber glow seeping through the windows. The desert night should have been pitch black, with only starlight illuminating the barren landscape. She stepped outside, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid desert air. Above the facility, a massive triangular craft hovered silently, its surface reflecting the stars like liquid mercury. The object was easily 200 feet across, with no visible propulsion system or navigation lights. Alana fumbled for her radio, trying to contact security, but only static emerged from the device. The craft descended slowly, stopping just 50 feet above the main antenna array. A low-frequency hum filled the air, vibrating through her bones and making her teeth ache. Brilliant white light erupted from the craft's underside, engulfing the entire facility in blinding radiance. Alina shielded her eyes, stumbling backward toward the control room. When the light faded, she found herself face to face with three beings standing between her and the building. They were tall and impossibly thin, with elongated limbs that moved with fluid grace. Their skin appeared translucent, revealing a network of dark veins beneath the surface. Large, black eyes dominated their featureless faces, reflecting the starlight like polished obsidian. The beings communicated without speaking, their thoughts pressing directly into Alana's mind with uncomfortable intensity. They showed her images of their dying world, a planet orbiting a red giant star in its final death throes. Their civilization had mastered interstellar travel out of desperation, searching the galaxy for new homes. Alina tried to run, but her legs refused to obey. The beings approached with measured steps, their mental presence growing stronger with each passing moment. They explained that Earth's radio telescopes had been inadvertently broadcasting humanity's location across the cosmos for decades. One of the creatures extended a long, skeletal finger toward Alina's forehead. The moment it made contact, her mind exploded with visions of vast, star-spanning civilizations, cosmic wars fought across millennia, and the terrible truth about humanity's place in the galactic hierarchy. Earth was not alone, but it was isolated for good reason. Humanity's violent nature and rapid technological advancement had marked them as a potential threat to older, more established species. The beings showed Alana images of other worlds that had been contained when they became too dangerous. The mental download continued for what felt like hours, though Alina's watch showed only minutes had passed. She learned about the Galactic Council that monitored developing civilizations, the protocols for intervention, and the fate that awaited species that failed to evolve beyond their aggressive instincts. When the connection finally broke, Alana collapsed to her knees in the desert sand. The beings retreated toward their craft, their message clear in her mind. Humanity had perhaps 50 years to prove they could transcend their destructive nature, or face the same fate as countless other worlds. The triangular ship rose silently into the night sky, accelerating to impossible speeds before vanishing among the stars. Alina remained on the ground, her mind reeling from the cosmic revelation. The radio telescope behind her continued its automated scanning, oblivious to the monumental encounter that had just occurred. She struggled to her feet, her legs unsteady as she made her way back to the control room. The signal that had started everything was gone, leaving only empty static across all frequencies. Alana stared at the blank screens, wondering if anyone would believe her account of what had transpired. The security guard found her 3 hours later, sitting motionless at her workstation. When he asked about the power fluctuations and strange readings from the night shift, Alana simply shook her head. She submitted her resignation the following morning, citing personal reasons. Alana never spoke publicly about her encounter at Atacama, but those close to her noticed the change. She became obsessed with environmental causes and peace initiatives, as if driven by some urgent, invisible deadline. Her colleagues attributed it to burnout from years of fruitless searching for extraterrestrial signals. She moved to a small village in the Andes, where she taught astronomy to local children and scanned the night sky with growing anxiety. Every clear evening, Alana would climb to the highest hill and watch for signs of returning visitors. The stars that once filled her with wonder now seemed cold and threatening. Years passed, and Alana aged rapidly, her hair turning white and deep lines etching her face. She kept detailed journals documenting strange atmospheric phenomena, unusual animal behavior, and reports of unexplained lights in the desert. The weight of cosmic knowledge had transformed her from a hopeful scientist into a reluctant prophet. On her deathbed, Alana whispered final words to her nurse about the Watchers among the stars and humanity's dwindling time. She spoke of signals hidden in radio noise and messages encoded in cosmic background radiation. Her last breath carried a warning that died with her in that small mountain clinic. The Atacama Observatory continues its mission today, its massive arrays searching for signs of intelligent life among the stars. But sometimes, late at night, when the desert wind howls across the facility, technicians report strange readings on their instruments and fleeting glimpses of lights that move too purposefully to be natural phenomena. Alana's research notes were archived and forgotten, filed away with thousands of other scientific documents that never quite fit the accepted paradigms. But hidden within her data lies evidence of that fateful night when the universe revealed its true nature to one terrified astronomer in the Chilean desert. The signal she detected was never officially recorded, existing only in Alana's personal logs and fragmented memories. Yet some researchers believe it continues to pulse across the cosmos, a beacon marking Earth's location for any civilization advanced enough to decode its meaning. The desert holds countless secrets beneath its shifting sands. Our next encounter takes us deeper into the unknown, where reality bends under starlit skies. Deep in the heart of the Gobi Desert, where ancient trade routes once carried silk and spices across endless dunes, Dr. Alana Vasquez made a discovery that would shatter her understanding of reality. As a zoologist studying nomadic migration patterns, she had spent 3 months cataloging artifacts in this remote region of Mongolia. But nothing in her academic training had prepared her for what she would encounter on that fateful October night in 2019. Alina had established her research camp near a series of peculiar rock formations that the local Mongolian guides called the Watchers, towering sandstone pillars that seemed to shift and change in the desert's ever-shifting light. Her team of graduate students had returned to Ulaanbaatar for supplies, leaving her alone with her equipment and the vast silence of the Gobi stretching endlessly in all directions. The temperature had dropped dramatically after sunset, as it always did in the desert. Alana huddled in her insulated tent, reviewing the day's photographs on her laptop. She had discovered several petroglyphs that didn't match any known cultural patterns, strange symbols that seemed to depict elongated figures with oversized heads, standing beneath what appeared to be disc-shaped objects in the sky. At exactly 11:47 p.m., according to her field notes, Alina's equipment began malfunctioning. Her GPS unit started displaying coordinates that placed her location somewhere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Her satellite phone emitted a high-pitched whine before going completely dead. Even her mechanical compass spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north. Then came the light. It started as a faint glow on the horizon, barely visible through the tense mesh window. Alina initially dismissed it as the aurora borealis, though she knew they were far too south for such a phenomenon. But as the light grew brighter and began to move with deliberate purpose, she realized this was something else entirely. Alana unzipped her tent and stepped into the frigid desert air. Above her, the stars that had been crystal clear moments before now seemed dim and distant. The source of the light was approaching from the northwest, a massive triangular craft that moved in complete silence across the star-filled sky. Its surface appeared to be made of some kind of reflective material that seemed to bend light around it, making it difficult to focus on directly. The craft was enormous, easily the size of a football stadium. 3 brilliant white lights marked each corner of the triangle, while a pulsing red light emanated from its center. As it passed overhead, Alina felt a strange sensation wash over her, a tingling that started in her fingertips and spread throughout her entire body. The air itself seemed to vibrate with an energy she couldn't identify. Alina fumbled for her camera, desperate to document what she was witnessing. But as she raised the device, the screen flickered and went black. Every piece of electronic equipment in her camp had been rendered useless by some kind of electromagnetic interference radiating from the craft above. The triangular object came to a complete stop directly overhead, hovering perhaps 200 feet above the desert floor. Alina could now see that its surface wasn't smooth as she had initially thought, but covered in intricate patterns that seemed to shift and flow like liquid mercury. The patterns pulsed with a soft blue-white light that created hypnotic geometric designs across the craft's hull. As Alina watched in stunned silence, a section of the craft's underside began to iris open, revealing a chamber filled with the same blue-white light. From this opening, 3 smaller objects descended disc-shaped craft about the size of automobiles. They moved with fluid grace, defying conventional physics as they changed direction instantly without any apparent propulsion system. The 3 smaller craft spread out in a triangular formation around Alana's camp. She could feel their presence as much as see them, a pressure in her mind that made her thoughts feel sluggish and disconnected. The temperature around her began to rise despite the desert's natural chill, and the sand beneath her feet started to emit a faint luminescence. Alina tried to run, but her legs wouldn't obey her commands. She found herself frozen in place, unable to move anything except her eyes. One of the smaller craft descended until it was hovering just 10 feet above the ground, close enough that she could see her reflection in its mirror-like surface. The craft's hull was seamless, without any visible seams, windows, or propulsion systems. A beam of pale yellow light emerged from the bottom of the nearest craft, enveloping Alana in its glow. She felt herself being lifted gently from the ground, her feet leaving the sand as she rose toward the waiting vessel. The sensation was unlike anything she had ever experienced, not the violent pull of being grabbed, but rather like being supported by invisible hands that cradled her entire body. As Alana was drawn into the craft, she caught a glimpse of the interior through what appeared to be a transparent section of the hull. The space inside was larger than should have been possible given the craft's external dimensions. Curved walls pulsed with soft bioluminescent patterns, and she could see figures moving within tall, slender beings with elongated limbs and heads that seemed too large for their bodies. The beings wore no clothing that Alana could identify, but their skin appeared to be covered in a substance that shifted between metallic silver and deep blue, almost like living mercury. Their eyes were enormous, taking up nearly a third of their faces, and they seemed to glow with an inner light that matched the patterns on the craft's walls. Alina found herself in a circular chamber with walls that curved seamlessly into the ceiling. The surface beneath her feet felt warm and slightly yielding, like walking on living tissue. The beings surrounded her, but she felt no fear. Instead, a profound sense of calm washed over her, as if her emotions were being carefully modulated by some external force. One of the beings approached her, moving with a fluid grace that seemed to defy gravity. When it reached out to touch her forehead, Alina felt a sudden rush of images and sensations flood her mind. She saw the Earth from space, but not as she knew it. This was Earth millions of years ago, when vast oceans covered continents that no longer existed, and strange creatures ruled the land and sea. The being's touch conveyed information directly into Alana's consciousness. She understood, without words, that these entities had been visiting Earth from Plana, studying the planet's evolution and the development of life. They had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations that predated human history by millions of years. The petroglyphs she had discovered weren't ancient human art. They were records left by previous contact events, warnings and messages passed down through generations of desert dwellers. Alana saw visions of their home world, a planet orbiting a dying red star in a galaxy so distant that light from Earth would take millions of years to reach it. Their civilization had mastered technologies that allowed them to fold space and time, making the vast distances between stars as traversable as walking from one room to another. But their sun was dying, and they were searching for new worlds where their species could survive. The being showed her images of other humans they had encountered over the centuries. Explorers, nomads, and researchers like herself, who had ventured into remote places where the veil between worlds was thin. Most were returned with their memories intact, but altered, carrying subconscious knowledge that would influence their future work and discoveries. A few like Alina, were chosen to remember everything. As the visions faded, Alana found herself back on the desert floor, lying on the sand beside her tent. The sky above was filled with stars, normal and bright, with no sign of the massive triangular craft or its smaller companions. Her equipment was functioning normally, her GPS showing her correct coordinates, her satellite phone displaying full signal strength. But Alana knew what she had experienced was real. The sand around her camp bore strange impressions, circular patterns that seemed to spiral inward toward a central point. Her clothes smelled of ozone and something else, something metallic and alien that she couldn't identify. Most telling of all, her camera's memory card contained dozens of photographs she didn't remember taking, images of the craft and its occupants that were crystal clear despite the electromagnetic interference she had experienced. Alana spent the remaining weeks of her expedition documenting everything she could remember, filling notebook after notebook with detailed descriptions and sketches. She collected samples of the affected sand, noting that it had been fused at the molecular level into a glass-like substance that didn't match any known geological process. When she returned to civilization, Alina faced a choice that would define the rest of her career. She could publish her findings and risk professional ridicule, or she could keep silent and carry the burden of her knowledge alone. She chose a middle path, incorporating her discoveries into her academic work in subtle ways, publishing papers on anomalous archaeological findings that hinted at the truth without stating it directly. Years later, Alina would return to the Gobi Desert many times, always hopping for another encounter. She established a research foundation dedicated to studying unexplained phenomena in remote archaeological sites, attracting other researchers who had experienced similar encounters. Together, they formed a quiet network of academics who understood that humanity's history was far more complex and mysterious than the textbooks suggested. The beings had chosen Alina to be a bridge between two worlds, a keeper of secrets that humanity wasn't yet ready to fully understand. In the vast silence of the Gobi Desert, where ancient trade routes once connected distant civilizations, she had become part of a much older and more profound connection, one that linked Earth to the stars themselves and reminded us that we are not alone in the infinite darkness of space. These encounters remind us that the desert holds secrets beyond our understanding. Let's continue with another chilling tale from the endless sands. Route 375 in Nevada earned its nickname, the extraterrestrial highway, for good reason. This desolate stretch of asphalt cuts through some of the most remote desert in America, where the nearest town might be 100 miles away, and cell phone towers are as rare as rain. It's here that truck driver Marcus Chen experienced something that would forever change his perspective on what lurks in the Nevada wilderness. Marcus had been driving long-haul routes for 15 years, crossing every major highway in the continental United States. He prided himself on being practical, level-headed, and completely immune to the tall tailies that circulated among truckers at rest stops. UFO stories, ghost sightings, mysterious lights. Marcus dismissed them all as the product of sleep-deprived minds and too much caffeine. That skepticism would be thoroughly tested on a cold February night in 2019. The load was routine. Electronics from Los Angeles to Salt Lake City, with a tight delivery schedule that meant driving through the night. Marcus had taken Route 375 dozens of times before, appreciating its emptiness and the way it allowed him to make good time without traffic or speed traps. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, a ribbon of black asphalt under a canopy of stars, so bright they seemed close enough to touch. It was just past 2 a.m. when Marcus first noticed the light in his rearview mirror. At first, he assumed it was another truck, maybe running without a full light array to save on battery. But as minutes passed, the light remained constant, not gaining ground, not falling behind, just maintaining perfect distance about a quarter-mile back. Marcus adjusted his speed several times, slowing down and speeding up, but the light matched his pace exactly. Probably some kid playing games, Marcus muttered to himself, though something about the light bothered him. It wasn't the warm yellow of headlights or the harsh white of modern LEDs. This light had an odd quality, almost blue-white, and it seemed to pulse very slightly, like a heartbeat made of photons. Marcus reached for his CB radio to see if he could raise whoever was behind him, but the radio produced only static. That's when Marcus noticed his truck's electronics beginning to behave strangely. The GPS screen flickered, showing his location, jumping randomly across the map. The radio cycled through stations on its own, producing bursts of static punctuated by fragments of voices speaking in what sounded like foreign languages. Even his dashboard lights dimmed and brightened in rhythm with the mysterious light behind him. Marcus pulled over at a wide spot in the road, expecting the other vehicle to pass. Instead, the light stopped as well, maintaining its distance. Marcus climbed down from his cab, the desert cold hitting him like a physical blow. The silence was absolute. No wind, no insects, no distant traffic. Just the ticking of his cooling engine and the sound of his own breathing. He walked to the back of his trailer, squinting into the darkness. But the light was too bright to make out any details of the vehicle behind it. "Hey," Marcus called out, his voice swallowed by the vast emptiness. "You having trouble? Need help?" No response came, just that steady, pulsing light. Marcus felt the hair on his arms stand up, and not from the cold. Something was fundamentally wrong with this situation. He climbed back into his truck and pulled onto the highway, deciding to push hard for the next town. But as Marcus accelerated, the light began to move, not following behind anymore, but rising. Marcus watched in his mirrors as the light lifted off the ground, climbing smoothly into the night sky. It moved with impossible grace, no sound of engines or rotors, just silent ascension. The light grew brighter as it rose, and Marcus could see it was attached to something large and dark, a shape that blocked out stars as it moved. The object positioned itself directly above Marcus's truck, matching his speed perfectly. The blue-white light now illuminated the entire highway, casting everything in an ethereal glow. Marcus's truck began to shake, not from engine vibration, but from something external, as if the air itself was trembling. The radio static grew louder, resolving into sounds that Marcus would later describe as like voices, but not human voices. Then the truck's engine died, not sputtered or coughed. It simply stopped, as if someone had turned off a switch. Marcus coasted to a stop in the middle of the empty highway, his headlights the only illumination besides the strange craft above. He tried the ignition repeatedly, but nothing happened. The engine wouldn't even turn over. Even his emergency flashers refused to work. The light above began to descend, and Marcus got his first clear look at the object. It was massive, easily the size of a football field, with a classic disc shape that seemed almost cliché, except for the fact that it was floating silently 50 feet above his truck. The surface appeared to be made of some dark metal that reflected the blue light in strange patterns. There were no visible seams, no windows, no obvious means of propulsion. As the craft lowered further, Marcus felt a strange, tingling sensation throughout his body, as if every nerve ending was being gently stimulated. The sensation wasn't painful, but it was deeply unsettling. He tried to move, but found his muscles responding sluggishly, as if he was underwater. The air inside the truck seemed to thicken, and breathing became an effort. A beam of light, different from the blue-white glow, suddenly shot down from the craft's center. This beam was pure white, so intense it hurt to look at directly. It struck the ground beside Marcus's truck, and where it touched, the asphalt began to glow with the same blue-white radiance as the craft. The beam moved slowly, methodically, as if scanning or searching for something. Marcus watched in fascination and terror as the beam approached his truck. When it finally enveloped the cab, the tingling sensation intensified to an almost unbearable degree. Every filling in his teeth seemed to vibrate, and he could taste metal in his mouth. The beam held him for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, and during that time, Marcus had the distinct impression that he was being examined, catalogued, studied by an intelligence vast and alien. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the experience ended. The beam retracted, the craft began to rise, and Marcus felt control returning to his body. The blue-white light grew smaller as the object climbed higher, until it was just another point of light among the stars. Marcus's truck engine started on the first try, all electronics functioning normally, as if nothing had happened. Marcus drove the remaining distance to Salt Lake City in a daze, arriving several hours later than scheduled. He told his dispatcher he'd had mechanical problems, which wasn't entirely untrue. But as days passed, Marcus began to notice changes. His vision seemed sharper, especially at night. He could see details in darkness that should have been invisible. More disturbing were the dreams, vivid, recurring visions of vast desert landscapes viewed from impossible heights, and the persistent feeling that something was watching him from the sky. Muckas never drove Route 375 again. He requested different routes, took pay cuts to avoid that stretch of highway. But sometimes, on clear nights when the stars are particularly bright, Muckas pulls over and looks up at the sky. And sometimes, just sometimes, he sees a familiar blue-white light moving among the constellations. And he knows that whatever happened that night on the extraterrestrial highway, it wasn't finished with him yet. The official record shows no unusual activity on Route 375 that February night. No radar contacts, no other witnesses, no physical evidence. Just another truck driver's story to add to the hundreds of others collected from that lonely stretch of Nevada desert. But Muckas knows what he saw, what he experienced, and he knows that some encounters leave marks that never fade, scars that remind us we're not alone in this vast, dark universe. But the desert holds more secrets than abandoned facilities. Sometimes the encounters happen to those who call the wasteland home, as our next story reveals. Dr. Alina Vasquez had spent 15 years studying atmospheric phenomena, but nothing in her extensive career had prepared her for what she would encounter at White Sands National Park in New Mexico. As a senior researcher for the National Weather Service, she was accustomed to unusual readings and unexplained meteorological events. But the data streaming in from the park's remote monitoring station defied every scientific principle she knew. It was October 2019 when Alana first noticed the anomalies. Temperature readings that fluctuated wildly without any corresponding weather patterns. Electromagnetic signatures that appeared and disappeared in perfect geometric sequences. Most disturbing of all were the seismic readings that suggested movement beneath the gypsum dunes, despite the area's geological stability. Alana decided to investigate personally, packing her equipment into a modified research vehicle designed for desert conditions. She arrived at White Sands just as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the endless white dunes in shades of gold and amber. The park's otherworldly beauty had always struck her as almost alien. But now, that comparison felt uncomfortably literal. She established her base camp near the heart of the dune field, far from the main visitor areas. As darkness fell, Alina began setting up her instruments: seismographs, electromagnetic field detectors, atmospheric pressure monitors, and high-definition cameras equipped with night vision capabilities. The desert air was crisp and still, carrying only the whisper of shifting sand. Around midnight, her equipment began registering the first anomalies. The electromagnetic readings spiked dramatically, creating patterns that resembled complex mathematical sequences. Alina watched in fascination as her instruments detected what appeared to be a massive object moving beneath the surface of the dunes, approximately 50 feet below ground level. The seismic data showed something extraordinary. The object wasn't moving randomly, but following precise geometric paths, creating an intricate underground network that spanned several square miles. Alina realized she was witnessing something that challenged everything she understood about physics and geology. Then the lights appeared. At first, they were subtle, barely visible against the star-filled sky. Soft, pulsing illumination that seemed to emanate from within the dunes themselves. Alina grabbed her cameras, documenting everything as the lights grew brighter and more defined. They formed complex patterns, shifting and morphing in ways that suggested intelligence and purpose. As Alina watched through her night vision equipment, the sand began to move. Not the gentle shifting caused by wind, but deliberate, purposeful movement that created perfect circles and spirals across the dune surfaces. The temperature around her dropped suddenly, and her breath became visible in the now frigid air. Her electromagnetic detectors screamed warnings as massive energy surges coursed through the area. Alina felt the hair on her arms stand up as static electricity filled the air. The lights beneath the sand grew more intense, and she could see geometric shapes pressing upward against the surface, as if something enormous was trying to emerge from below. That's when Alina saw them. Tall, slender figures moving between the dunes with impossible grace and speed. They appeared to be humanoid, but elongated, with limbs that seemed too long for their bodies. In the green glow of her night vision, she could see they wore no clothing, their skin appearing smooth and pale, almost translucent in the strange light. The beings moved with purpose, gathering around specific points where the underground lights were broadest. Alina watched in terror and fascination as they began some kind of ritual or procedure, their movements synchronized and precise. They seemed to be communicating without sound, their heads turning toward each other in perfect unison. Alina's scientific training warred with her survival instincts. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to run, but her curiosity and professional dedication kept her rooted in place, documenting everything. She realized she was witnessing something that could change humanity's understanding of life in the universe. The beings suddenly stopped their activities and turned toward Alina's position. Despite being nearly a quarter-mile away and hidden behind equipment, she felt their attention focus on her like a physical weight. Her instruments detected a massive surge in electromagnetic activity, and several of her devices sparked and died. One of the beings began moving toward her location, covering the distance with impossible speed. Alina could see it more clearly now through her remaining night vision camera. Its features were alien, yet somehow familiar, with large, dark eyes that seemed to contain infinite depth. Its movements were fluid, almost floating above the sand rather than walking through it. As the being approached, Alina felt a strange sensation in her mind, as if someone was gently probing her thoughts. Images flashed through her consciousness, vast underground chambers carved from crystal, technology that defied comprehension, and star maps showing systems far beyond human knowledge. She realized the being was communicating with her telepathically. The mental contact revealed fragments of an incredible truth. The beings had been using the area beneath White Sands as a research station for centuries, studying Earth's geology and atmosphere. The gypsum dunes provided perfect camouflage and natural electromagnetic shielding for their activities. They were not invaders, but observers, documenting the planet's evolution and humanity's development. Alina learned that the underground facility extended for miles, containing technology that could manipulate matter at the molecular level and create the perfect environmental conditions for their research. The lights she had witnessed were byproducts of their energy systems, occasionally bleeding through to the surface when their activities intensified. The being conveyed a sense of urgency and concern. Their research had detected alarming changes in Earth's climate and magnetic field, changes that could have catastrophic consequences for all life on the planet. They had been trying to understand these phenomena and find ways to mitigate the damage, but their efforts required secrecy to avoid panic and interference. As quickly as the mental contact had begun, it ended. The being stepped back, and Alina felt her consciousness return fully to her own control. The other figures in the distance had resumed their activities, but now Alina understood they were conducting vital research that could ultimately benefit humanity. The lights beneath the sand began to fade, and the electromagnetic readings on her remaining instruments returned to normal levels. The beings completed their work and began moving away, their forms becoming increasingly translucent until they disappeared entirely. The desert returned to its natural state, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. Alina spent the rest of the night reviewing her data and footage, trying to process what she had experienced. Her scientific mind struggled to accept the reality of what she had witnessed, but the evidence was undeniable. She had made contact with an intelligence far beyond human understanding, and that intelligence was working to protect the planet she called home. When dawn broke over the white dunes, Alina packed her equipment and prepared to leave. She knew she faced an impossible choice: reveal her discoveries to the scientific community and risk ridicule or suppression, or keep the secret and protect the beings who were working to save her world. As she drove away from White Sands, Alina noticed her instruments detecting one final electromagnetic pulse from deep beneath the dunes. It felt like a farewell, an acknowledgement of the trust that had been shared between two species separated by vast differences in evolution and understanding. Dr. Alina Vasquez never published her findings from that night at White Sands. She continued her atmospheric research, but now with the knowledge that humanity was not alone, and that sometimes the most profound discoveries must remain hidden to protect both the discoverers and the discovered. The white dunes keep their secrets still, sheltering research that may one day save us all. The desert holds many secrets, and our next encounter will test the very limits of human understanding and survival instincts. Nomad had been crossing the Sahara for 30 years, following the ancient trade routes his grandfather had taught him. The desert held no secrets from him, or so he believed, until that night when the stars themselves seemed to descend from heaven. It was his third day traveling alone from Timbuktu to Gao, his camel laden with salt and precious stones. The familiar rhythm of hooves on sand had lulled him into a meditative state when something made him look up. The constellation of Orion, which should have been directly overhead, was missing 3 of its brightest stars. Nomad pulled his camel to a halt, squinting at the night sky. In all his years navigating by the stars, he had never seen anything like this. The missing stars left a triangular void in the familiar pattern, as if someone had plucked them from the heavens with invisible fingers. Then he saw the lights moving across the dunes to his east, 3 brilliant points of white light, arranged in a perfect triangle, skimming just above the sand. They moved with purpose, searching, casting beams that illuminated the desert floor in perfect circles of daylight. His camel began to panic, its eyes rolling white with terror. The animal had faced sandstorms, predators, and the harshest conditions the desert could offer. But whatever approached filled it with primal fear. Mahmoud dismounted quickly, wrapping the reins around his wrist as he tried to calm the beast. The triangular formation of lights changed direction, heading directly toward him. As they drew closer, Nomad could see they weren't separate objects at all, but lights mounted on the corners of something massive, a craft so dark it was nearly invisible against the star-filled sky. The object settled onto the sand 50 meters away with complete silence. No engine noise, no displacement of air, nothing but the gentle whisper of sand particles falling from its hull. It was roughly triangular, perhaps 40 meters on each side, with a surface that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Nomad reached for the curved dagger at his belt, knowing it would be useless against whatever this was, but needing the comfort of familiar steel in his hand. His grandfather had told him stories of jinn who lived in the deep desert, spirits who could take any form they chose. Perhaps this was one of them. A section of the craft's hull simply wasn't there anymore, not opened, not lowered, just gone as if it had never existed. Soft blue light spilled out from the opening, and with it came a sound like wind chimes made of crystal, hauntingly beautiful and utterly alien. 3 figures emerged from the light. They were tall and impossibly thin, their limbs too long for their bodies. They wore no clothing that Mahmoud could see, their skin a pale gray that seemed to shimmer in the starlight. Their heads were large and elongated, with eyes that reflected the desert stars like black mirrors. They moved toward him with a gliding motion, their feet barely touching the sand. Mahmoud found himself unable to move, not from fear, but from a strange paralysis that had settled over his limbs like heavy blankets. His camel had gone completely still beside him, as if it too was held by invisible bonds. The lead figure stopped just beyond arm's reach and tilted its head, studying Mahmoud with those mirror-black eyes. When it spoke, the words formed directly in his mind, bypassing his ears entirely. The voice was neither male nor female, carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in his bones. "You know this place," the voice said, and somehow Mahmoud understood that it wasn't speaking of the immediate location, but of the entire desert, the ancient paths, the hidden wells and landmarks known only to the Tuareg. Mahmoud tried to speak, but found his throat frozen. The being seemed to sense his struggle and touched his forehead with one impossibly long finger. Immediately, the paralysis lifted from his vocal cords, though his body remained immobile. "I am Mahmoud ibn Hassan," he managed to whisper. "I mean no harm. I am only a trader following the paths of my fathers." "We know," the being replied. "We have watched your people cross these sands for millennia. You navigate by the stars we placed in your sky. Follow the paths we carved in the stone beneath the sand. Tonight, we have need of your knowledge." The other 2 beings moved to flank Mahmoud, and he felt a strange, tingling sensation as they seemed to examine him without touching. One of them gestured toward the eastern horizon, where the first pale hint of dawn was beginning to show. Your people call it the Valley of Whispers. We must reach it before the sun stands directly overhead tomorrow. Mahmoud's blood chilled. The Valley of Whispers was a cursed place, avoided by all desert peoples. Legend said it was where the jinn held council, where the voices of the dead could be heard on the wind. No Tuareg would willingly go there, especially not during the day when the spirits were said to be strongest. "I cannot," Mahmoud said, finding strength in his voice. "That place is forbidden. The spirits there are angry, hungry. They devour the souls of those who disturb their rest." The being's head tilted further, almost to a 90-degree angle. "Your spirits and ours are not the same. What you fear there, we must reclaim. It was taken from us long ago, when your world was young and the desert was green with life. images suddenly flooded Mahmoud's mind, visions of the Sahara as it had been millions of years ago, a lush paradise of rivers and forests. He saw great cities of crystal and metal rising from verdant plains, populated by beings like those who stood before him. He watched as catastrophe struck, as the climate changed, and the great civilization retreated underground, leaving only scattered outposts and hidden artifacts. The device in the Valley of Whispers is one of our last communication arrays, the being explained as the visions faded. It has been calling to us across the void, but something corrupts its signal. Something that feeds on the fear and superstition of your people, growing stronger with each generation that avoids that place. Mahmoud understood now why his camel had been so terrified, why every instinct screamed at him to flee. These beings were ancient beyond human comprehension, and they were asking him to guide them to the most dangerous place in the desert. "What you offer in return?" he asked, surprising himself with his boldness. The being's features shifted in what might have been a smile. "Knowledge. The true paths through the deep desert, the locations of water that will never run dry, the signs that predict sandstorms days before they form. You will become the greatest guide your people have ever known." The offer was tempting, but Mahmoud thought of his family waiting for him in Gao, of the children who would never know their father if he died in the Valley of Whispers. "And if I refuse, then we will find another way, though it will take much longer. You will return to your journey with no memory of this encounter, living your life as you always have. But the corruption in the valley will continue to grow, and eventually it will spread beyond that cursed place." Mahmoud closed his eyes, feeling the weight of decision pressing down on him like the desert sun at noon. When he opened them again, he saw something in the being's dark gaze that looked almost like hope. "But we go by my rules. We travel at night when the spirits sleep, and we approach the valley from the north, where the old protection stones still stand." The being nodded, and suddenly Mahmoud could move again. The paralysis lifted like a heavy cloak being removed from his shoulders. His camel snorted and shook its head, but remained calm, as if it too had been released from whatever force had held them. "We leave within the hour," the being said. "Your mount will be able to keep pace with our craft. Do not be afraid when we lift you from the ground. The journey will be swifter through the air." As the three beings glided back toward their craft, Mahmoud looked up at the sky and saw that the missing stars had returned to Orion's belt. But now he knew they weren't stars at all, just distant lights on ships like this one, watching and waiting in the vast darkness above the desert. The next chapter of Mahmoud's journey would take him to the Valley of Whispers, where ancient technology and desert spirits would collide in ways that would change his understanding of the world forever. But that encounter and the terrifying discovery waiting in the cursed valley would test not just his courage, but his very sanity. These encounters remind us that the desert holds secrets beyond our understanding. Now, let's explore another chilling tale from the endless sands. Deep in Israel's Negev desert, where ancient trade routes once carried caravans across endless dunes, Dr. Sarah Chen made a discovery that would challenge everything she thought she knew about our place in the universe. As an archaeologist specializing in Nabatean settlements, Sarah had spent months excavating a remote site near the Ramon crater, searching for artifacts that might shed light on the mysterious desert traders who once controlled the incense routes. The dig site sat isolated, 40 kilometers from the nearest settlement, surrounded by nothing but rolling hills of sand and limestone. Sarah's team had departed 3 days earlier, leaving her alone to catalog their final discoveries before the winter rains arrived. She preferred the solitude. It allowed her to work without interruption, to feel connected to the ancient peoples whose lives she studied. On her final night at the site, Sarah was working late in her temporary lab, a reinforced tent equipped with examination tables and preservation equipment. The generator hummed quietly outside, powering her lights and climate control systems. She was carefully cleaning a ceramic fragment when the first anomaly occurred. Every piece of electronic equipment in her tent suddenly died. The silence was immediate and complete. No generator hum, no air circulation, no LED displays glowing in the darkness. Sarah reached for her flashlight, but it too remained dead despite fresh batteries. Even her digital camera and satellite phone showed no signs of life. She stepped outside into the desert night, expecting to find a simple generator malfunction. But what she discovered defied all explanation. The stars above the Negev were gone, not hidden by clouds or atmospheric distortion, but simply absent, as if someone had switched off the celestial lights. In their place hung a massive dark shape, blocking out a significant portion of the sky. Sarah could barely make out its edges against the slightly lighter darkness of space. It appeared triangular, with smooth curves along its perimeter. As her eyes adjusted to the profound darkness, she began to notice details that made her archaeological training seem woefully inadequate. The object wasn't just large, it was enormous, easily several hundred meters across. Its surface seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating a void in the sky that hurt to look at directly. And it was completely, unnaturally silent. Sarah stood frozen beside her dead generator, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. This wasn't a conventional aircraft. No engine noise, no navigation lights, no radio chatter. It hung motionless above the desert, like a piece of the night sky had been cut away and replaced with something else entirely. Something that didn't belong to Earth. Then the lights began, starting as tiny pinpricks along the object's edge. They grew brighter and more numerous, forming complex patterns that seemed to pulse with intelligence. The lights weren't random. They moved in sequences, creating geometric shapes that reminded Sarah of the mathematical principles she'd studied in Nabatan architecture. But these patterns were far more complex, suggesting knowledge that surpassed human understanding. As the light display intensified, Sarah felt a strange sensation in her mind, not quite hearing, not quite thinking, but something in between. Images began forming in her consciousness. Vast cities beneath desert sands, ancient peoples looking up at similar lights, star maps showing routes between worlds she'd never imagined. The visions came faster now, overwhelming her trained skepticism with their vivid detail. She saw the Nabatans not as simple traders, but as guardians of knowledge left by previous visitors. Their caravans hadn't just carried spices and incense. They'd transported artifacts